T-minus 20 seconds and counting. We are go. Guidance internal.
Roll program confirmed.
10, 9, 8, 7. Ignition sequence start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Benz and the Daimler were built the same year that I was born. That vintage year was 1885. At the age of 7, I was awed by the glamour of the steam locomotive 999, which had recently made a world speed record of 112.5 miles an hour. When I showed the engineer of the 999 a drawing I made of his locomotive, he took me up into the cab and allowed me to fondle the throttle, a big day for a 7-year-old boy. At Palm Beach in 1898, I found some horseless age magazines in a hotel lobby. So lucky for me, I transferred my interest from steam and electric power to the potential in gasoline. My new enthusiasm was formally confirmed in 1903 when I subscribed to a cycle and automotive trade journal. That year in Detroit, a handful of nervous investors with $28,000 capitalized a venture to be known as the Ford Motor Company. History would show that they had nothing to be edgy about. My first auto ride wasn't until 1902, when my 16-year-old chum acquired a mobile steamer. He allowed me to drive after showing me how to steer around corners by pushing the tiller with my knee. But the steam cars took forever and a day to fire up for a start. My first ride in a gasoline car was another chum and his Northern automobile, a remarkably good car for the time. I drove from Pittsburgh to Gettysburg in 1906 and met only one other automobile on the 3-day trip. Now the same trip can be made in 3 hours. Later I secured a Pennsylvania driver's license number 19,420 in 1907, when no intelligence test was needed. It was on August 1st, 1914 that I bought a Model T Ford Roadster for $440, motor number 554,792. On the very next day, Germany declared war on Russia, starting World War I. The world has never been the same since. It was at this time that Henry Ford promised that if he sold 300,000 Fords in 1 year, he would return between $40 and $60 to each car owner, thus automatically enlisting 250,000 salesmen for the Model T. Henry kept faith, and I duly received my $50 refund, although it cost the Ford Motor Company $15 million in rebates. Our children insist I was born lucky, lucky in cars, lucky in the woman I married, and also in buying the first Model T on August 1st, 1914. If I had bought it 1 day earlier, I would have not received that $50 rebate of this brass-trimmed, stem-winding flivver. After I bought my car, the Ford salesman persuaded me to work at the Pittsburgh branch at the Ford Motor Company. After working a week or so on the assembly line, I was moved to the shipping department and then to the repair department. After working for some time in the repair department, I was promoted to assistant service manager to answer letters from car owners in the tri-state area. There I was continually hatching new ideas. During World War I first served as an instructor at Carnegie Institute of Technology. then as a lecturer in the auto service mechanics at the University of Pittsburgh. In the early years of the war, I worked as a technical editor of the Ford section of the Automobile Trade Journal. A.L. Dyke offered me $150 to revise the Ford section of his big Dyke's Auto Encyclopedia. As is acknowledged at the bottom on page 770 of the 1918 edition, I did so. When the publisher of the early Ford Owner magazine started sending me letters to answer at $1 per letter, we started an Ask Me Another page, selecting those of general interest for publication. When this grew to over $200 a month, the publisher, Mr. Harry Apple, decided it would be better to have an all-inclusive contract based, as he said, on mutual trust, since the Ford Owner was published in Milwaukee, 550 miles away from Pittsburgh, where I lived. This gentleman's agreement was renewed for the next 40 years. When this magazine was sold in 1955, Mr. Apple gave me a 6 months additional bonus as severance pay. I joined the Society of Automotive Engineers in 1921. I became the chairman of the Pittsburgh section in 1931, and a member of the National Council in 1941. I was also field editor for the SAE Journal for many years, and have been on the local governing board practically ever since. Once stopping at a Ford branch and peeping in at a big meeting that was going on, the speaker saw me and with a sense of humor said, "Fellows, the only French I learned during the war is unprintable, but I've got a special treat for you. I'm going to introduce you a man that wrote a whole book in French called L'Auto Ford. Murray, come to the platform." How could I refuse, when I really didn't wish to? As I chattered, time marched on. Outside, it happened that my mother had been riding with me in my Ford, and growing impatient, she sent in a messenger, my good friend Bill Cook. Choking with emotion, Bill called, "Mr. Fahnestock, excuse me for interrupting you, but your mama wants you." And I thought I had him as a friend. I left immediately, pride before a fall. When the Ford Field became a dealer magazine, I tried to help dealers to sell their cars by explaining mechanical features in simple terms. I felt that if I could understand it, then everybody else also could. I must admit that the crude sketches illustrating early Ford Owner articles were my own. Credit is due to Hazel, my wife, for those line drawings made after we were married in 1925. Some are initialed HMF, and some are not. Quoting from the introduction to Model T Speed Secrets, the Fast Ford Handbook, which Murray wrote, "Model T was faster than a man could run. It was even faster than a horse could run. That was not fast enough for many owners who wanted something even faster than a wife." In the hands of youth and the knowing hands of seasoned mechanics, Model T became the first car for fun. Parts came tumbling off as natural as fall foliage in October. Hopping up was a second nature. Calculating fast Ford builders began as amateurs, with an eye and ear for the road racing and cross-country runs then being staged by many prominent motor builders. As the interest proliferated, a need for speed parts became plain. In the age of the experimenter, the strongest of the fast Ford enthusiasts began to go professional with their speed secrets. First parts offerings were primitive in design. By the post-war teens, some products, from crankshaft to complete bodies, approached very satisfying levels of acceptability. As the dust settled from this era of the fast home-built car, one inalienable fact emerged. Appreciation had become universal for the Model T Ford chassis, and particularly for its understressed engine block, as a basis for bigger things than the maker had intended. Fast forwarding advanced into the days of professionalism early in the 20s, when speed equipment reached an advanced stage, with offerings like the Chevrolet Brothers Frontenac line. The sport's greatest boost came from performance of their out-and-out racing Fronty Fords at the Indianapolis 500, using the common Ford block, where levels of speed and endurance attained new stature. This coming of age in the speed equipment field brought a strengthening of popular interest in the Ford as a speed car. In a final tabulation of the writings on Ford cars over a 40-year tenure, Murray's word count approached that of William Shakespeare. Sometimes a publisher would put his own name on as author. Since Murray was working for money, he simply grinned, took the cash, and let the credit go.
When I got ready to build my first Speedster, I read a lot of Murray Fahnestock reprinted in the vintage Ford. My favorite article was the Hellcat Gentleman Speedster. I learned a lot about building bodies because Murray always had dimensions on his drawings, and I could tailor them to what I wanted to do. Our good friend Ted Ashman used to quote Murray in his tinkering tips a lot. The combination of what I read in tinkering tips and the articles, especially about speedsters, transmissions, coils, points, electrical system, valve timing, all of these things enabled me to have a good running speedster, thanks to Murray.